to play their part.
Mr. President.
Here, the Honourable Dr. John Kaye.
Thank you, Mr. President. 132 years ago, Sir Henry Parkes, the then Premier of New South Wales, passed the Public Instruction Act through both houses of this Parliament. With the passage of that Act, there was a creation of a social contract between the Government of New South Wales and the community and the people of New South Wales. A promise that every child, no matter who their father and mother were, no matter what the circumstances at their birth happened to be, would achieve a high quality of education. For the 100 years after that, Mr. President, this state, this Parliament and the governments that were elected by this Parliament continued to improve on that model with the creation of the Wyndham model and a guarantee of comprehensive secondary education within the public sector to every child in New South Wales, and the creation of the technical and further education system and its rollout throughout the 60s, 70s and 80s to create a promise that for those students who were not interested in straight academic subjects, there was a commitment from the state to ensure that they had high-quality vocational education and training. Mr. President, that promise is being broken here today by this government. Mr. President, throughout the last election, I sat on platforms with the now Education Minister, then Shadow Education Minister, Mr. Adrian Piccoli. And Mr. Piccoli told every audience who would listen to him that I'm here, quote, "I'm here to tell you I am not Terry Metherell." Of course, he was referring to the former Education Minister under the Greiner government who slashed and burnt his way through public schools and TAFE colleges. Well, we're here today to tell Mr. Piccoli that he is indeed the reincarnation of Terry Metherell. $1.7 billion. He's a political reincarnation. 1.7. No, the people of New South Wales got rid of him. $1.7 billion cut out of the education system of New South Wales.
Phelps will contain his enthusiasm for history until he has the opportunity to speak later in the debate.
$1.7 billion, thank you, Mr. President, $1.7 billion cut out of the education systems of New South Wales, $1.7 billion taken out of the future of New South Wales, a record that Terry Metherell himself would be very proud of. Mr. President, what does this mean for public schools? Well, we know about 1,000 employees will lose their jobs over the next 4 years as a result of this. We're told they're not teachers, and here the New South Wales government falls back on its back office myth. The idea, oh, well, it doesn't matter. It's all this, and we heard it from the Reverend Fred Nile when he talked about the fat in the Department of Education. I invite the Reverend Fred Nile, through you, Mr. President, to go down and meet with some of the people who work in the Department of Education and to talk to teachers in the public sector and to understand the important role that the regional offices and the head office plays in the delivery of public education. There is no division between back office and front office. Whenever a teacher stands up in a public school classroom, they are supported by their district, by their region and by their head office. When they teach drug awareness, they rely on programs that come out of the Drug and Alcohol Unit within the Department of Education, a unit that will no longer exist because of these cuts. When they teach literacy and numeracy, they rely on the programs that come from the Curriculum Learning and Information Centre within the Department of Education here in Bridge Street. Mr. President, CLIC will no longer exist because of these cuts. When they stand up in a classroom, they are dependent upon the fact that there are office staff who answer the phones, maintain the roles, maintain the uniform policy, maintain the basic running of the school, make sure that the science staff and science labs have the equipment in them that they need for the science experiments, make sure that the science equipment is ordered, make sure that the excursions are properly planned, make sure that the school runs smoothly. Mr. President, it is as much a part of teaching in a classroom to have a support staff in the front office as it is to have a teacher in front of that classroom. Yet this government is taking away the fundamental support and saying, it's all okay, that's fine, doesn't matter. You know why? Because we're not hurting teachers in the classroom. Well, Mr. President, this plan, this arrangement is going to damage classroom teaching as surely as if you took teachers out of the classroom. And to pretend otherwise would be simply to put your head in the sand over what happens inside public school classrooms. Mr. President, it's extremely clear that not only does this government not care about public education, it doesn't even have the imagination to come up with its own nasty schemes. In fact, most of what they're doing comes from a Boston Consulting report that was commissioned by the previous Minister for Education, the then Honourable Verity Firth. In fact, she talked in that report, Mr. President, in that report, commissioned by the previous Labor government, they spoke about cutting state and regional offices, of $50 to $100 million a year total savings within state and regional offices.
Endorse that.
They also, no, we certainly don't endorse it. We opposed it at the time. We oppose it now. All I'm saying is that you guys don't even have the imagination to come up with your own schemes. They identified, based on the Victorian model, $750 million that could be found from cutting workforce employees in administration. Mr. President, the blueprint was written by the previous government. It's being implemented by this government. This is the Boston Consulting's view of education. It is not the view of education that comes from the teacher workforce. It is not the view of education that the parents and citizens of New South Wales want. They want quality public schools. They want those schools to be well-resourced and well-supported. But, Mr. President, this attack does not just stop at the doors of public schools. It goes straight into the TAFE colleges of New South Wales. 800 jobs out of TAFE around New South Wales. That's 5% of the employees gone from the TAFE system. That means 5% fewer teachers in front of classrooms, 5% less administrative support, 5% fewer courses being offered, 5% less time to look after students, 5% off the value of education, 5% off the economy of New South Wales, shaved off to save a handful of millions of dollars because this government doesn't care about working class kids who go to TAFE. Mr. President, TAFE has no fat. You can't cut the fat out of a system that has been regularly and repeatedly had its guts cut out of it. The previous Labor government cut 48% per student out of the funding of TAFE. 48%. If it kept pace with just inflation, not just education inflation, but just raw CPI inflation and the number of students, TAFE, by the time the previous government left, would have been getting 48% more. That's about $1.2 billion gone from TAFE. $1.2 billion gone from TAFE, and now the New South Wales coalition government says Labor didn't damage it enough. Let us come in, let us bang this TAFE's head against the wall. Let's see what we can do to undermine the future of vocational education and training at a time, Mr. President, when TAFE is being massively privatised. And not only that, boost the TAFE fees by 9.5%. The previous government, over its term in office, increased TAFE fees by 15% ahead of inflation. This government wants to increase it by another 9.5%. And what every single study taken on participation in higher education, in post-secondary education, says if you increase the fees, you lose the kids and the young adults from disadvantaged backgrounds. What this is saying is we don't care about the kids who come from families where there's no history or tradition of educational achievement. We don't care about those kids. We're throwing them on the dustbin. We're consigning their future to the low-waged, low-skilled economy, which is rapidly disappearing. Mr. President, if this government cared about the future of this economy, if this government cared about the future of social cohesion, if this government cared about the word social justice, they would make sure that TAFE fees were reduced, not increased. It is an investment in a fairer and more successful and more cohesive society. But to take money out of TAFE and to put higher TAFE fees means you're asking those kids who do get to TAFE to pay more in order to receive less. It is a con job that is purely about this government's intent to privatise TAFE, to drive students into the private sector and to reduce TAFE to nothing but a shell. Mr. President, coalition members have spoken about the idea that there needs to be hard decisions made. That's because they like hard decisions. They know full well that the black hole that they were presented with was plastic, it was elastic. It was invented by Treasury in order to drive a shrink the government agenda. Every government, when they come to power, is presented with the budget black hole by their Treasury Secretary, and those governments that are silly enough to fall for it end up damaging the future of our society. They are creating a black hole not now, but a black hole in 5 and 10 years' time by cutting back on education. Mr President, $300 million in poker machine tax rebates. If they were worried about the budget black hole, why did they give away $300 million to the rich pubs and clubs? $250 million over the last decade in increased funding to non-government schools, way ahead of the rate of increase. That's a 25% increase in their funding, way ahead of, that was Labor, way ahead of the funding increases to government schools.
The honourable member's time. The Honourable Walt Secord.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to support the motion and condemn the O'Farrell government